On September 11, 2001, the United States came under attack. The targets, New York City and the capital, Washington, D.C. The entire world was shocked. Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group in Afghanistan led by Osama bin Laden, claimed responsibility for the attack. Just 2 days earlier, on September the 9th, he had his only opponent assassinated, a local hero in the Afghan resistance, Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud.
I remember Massoud saying, "There's someone who's very dangerous to you, bin Laden."
5 months before the 9/11 attacks, Massoud visited France, where he issued a stark warning to the Western world.
He told us he only had one message. It was that Osama bin Laden was preparing a major strike against the United States, something extremely dangerous.
در راه رسیدن صلح کمک نکنه به یقین که مشکل نه تنها دامنگیر افغانستان بلکه دامنگیر امریکا و تعداد بیشتری از کشورها خواهد شد.
Massoud's warning was loud and clear. Why did no one listen? Was it the trade agreements or the arms sales to Pakistan that made the USA and other Western countries look the other way? Why did they refuse to help Massoud, the last line of defense against the Taliban and the terrorists? After 10 years of war to seize control of Afghanistan, the Soviets finally conceded and withdrew in 1989. When Kabul's communist regime crumbled 3 years later, civil war broke out between rebels from various ethnic groups: Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras and Pashtuns. Afghanistan spiraled into chaos. This ethnic conflict gave rise to a new movement, the Taliban. In Pashto, Talib literally means theology student. The Taliban are an Islamic fundamentalist group that focus on the study of Islam. Their supreme leader was Mullah Muhammad Omar, a hardcore fundamentalist who welcomed terrorists into his ranks from Saudi Arabia and Yemen. These were Al-Qaeda jihadists, and their leader was Osama bin Laden. In September 1996, the Taliban seized Kabul and most of the country, imposing a tyrannical Islamic regime and Sharia law. Only one man dared resist, Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, a Tajik from the Panjshir Valley. Based in the isolated northern mountains, he achieved folk hero status after defeating the Red Army during the Soviet occupation, and then led a northern alliance that struggled to resist the Taliban.
I was pretty good in school and studied at the Saint-Cyr Military Academy. I spent 3 great years in France's finest school, receiving a military education, but also learning engineering, history, and geography. Subjects needed to understand the modern world. That's how I started my career as a military officer in the French army. But after several disappointments, I resigned in 1999 and became a free civilian again. I introduced myself to Massoud as a former French officer and told him about the time I was on a diving mission where we planted mines under boats and sabotaged propellers. He joked that the Taliban didn't have any boats. And then I said something that finally caught his attention. I was a certified French commando instructor. It turns out that Massoud had a team of commandos, a group that was a mix of both young recruits and veterans. He gathered them at a training camp and told me, "You're a commando instructor. Here you go. Do your thing and teach them whatever you want." I had carte blanche. At that time, I think we had about 15,000 fighters on the various fronts. We were up against 10 times as many men, but we resisted. The Taliban was well equipped and had a lot of support from Pakistan, which wanted them to take over the country.
Armed by Pakistan and supported by al-Qaeda fighters, the Taliban quickly gained control of 90% of Afghan territory. In the heart of their repressive regime, a single French representative remained in office in Kabul, the chargé d'affaires, Jean-Yves Bateau.
I had a position with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, the UNSMA. Its goal was to establish peace in a country that was being ripped apart at the time. I continued to do my job in Afghanistan, but I also became the chargé d'affaires. That coincided with what came a few months later, when unfortunately the Taliban took control of the country.
In the previous 20 to 30 years, many Westerners had adopted a false understanding of diplomacy. It was a kind of Western triumphalism that we only talked to people who shared our values, and that's absurd. Diplomacy exists for exactly the opposite reason. It's designed as an alternative to war for addressing conflicts. It's based on being open to dialogue with anyone and everyone to understand their position. Then you adjust the level of talks, their symbolism. But once we understood the level of control the Taliban had in Afghanistan, there was no way we could get involved, even though we thought we should be helping Massoud.
The moment they arrived in Kabul in 1996, the Taliban publicly hanged ex-President Najibullah and his brother. It was an introduction to their barbaric interpretation of the Quran. The religious students virtuously claimed they were bringing back peace, but it came at a huge cost to the 17 million Afghans. The mullah professed to be fighting vice with virtue and did so by imposing the most obscurant and inhumane Islamic system on the planet.
My name is Maulvi Kalamuddin, and I'm the leader of the revolutionary Islamic movement in Afghanistan. I was the Taliban's minister for propagation of virtue and prevention of vice. My goal was to heavily promote virtue until all vices disappeared naturally. We never wanted to directly or brutally intervene. That's why we trained people, young people. They went to the mosques in small groups to raise awareness and warn against all types of temptations. This was necessary to get uneducated people to follow Islamic precepts. We needed to teach them to abandon their vices and renounce everything that Islam prohibits.
La délégation des talibans que nous faisions venir à
The Taliban delegation that we invited to Islamabad for peace negotiations stayed in a small guest house next to our offices.
Guest house à côté de nos bureaux. Et nous avions aussi la
And it so happened that the UN mission leader's secretary was staying in the same guest house.
Qui habitait la même guest house. She
came in the next morning looking very tired because the Taliban in the room next door had been watching porn until 4 in the morning, and this poor lady was unable to sleep. That helped us understand that, at the end of the day, the Taliban were human beings made of flesh and blood, and despite their claims of piety, they succumbed to their temptations.
The Taliban are terrorists. They don't believe in peace. Their philosophy is to create eternal war. They view jihad as a religious principle, an Islamic obligation that forces the Taliban to fight constantly. Otherwise, they believe they'll be lost to sin. They believe that jihad guarantees them entry to heaven and that God will grant them mercy. The Taliban have absolutely nothing in common with the Afghan people or Afghan society.
Pakistan, backed by Western nations and an ally of the US, wanted to control Afghanistan. It was in Pakistan's Quranic schools that the Taliban were born and trained.
Le Pakistan était le soutien majeur.
Pakistan was the Taliban's major supporter. The Pakistanis thought it would be good to have a regime under their influence in Kabul. But they quickly realized that they didn't really control it at all. Sometimes their puppets went their own way. In our meetings with the Pakistanis, we asked them to rein in the Taliban, and they said it wasn't that easy, because of course, they were uncontrollable.
The Americans didn't have a counterpart in Afghanistan. They knew they couldn't recognize the Taliban regime. They couldn't be associated with it. So the American vision of Afghanistan was what was seen through Pakistani eyes. Pakistan was a U.S. ally and told Washington that the Taliban was simply part of traditional Afghan culture and that they needed to accept that fact. They said Massoud was simply a Panjshiri, a Tajik, a group that didn't mean much and that had never ruled Afghanistan. They weren't a proper solution to lead the country.
The Pakistanis had a tense relationship with Commander Massoud. They knew that Ahmad Shah Massoud would never recognize a Pakistani puppet government. The Pakistanis saw that as resistance and as direct opposition to them. It's true, because my brother would have never accepted a pro-Pakistan government in Kabul. And that's the real reason why the United States never helped him, regardless of what they claim.
In June 2000, a European parliamentary delegation travelled to Panjshir to meet Commander Massoud. Leading the charge was General Philippe Morillon, who had previously served as commander of UN forces in the former Yugoslavia and was a well-established peace advocate. The man who instigated the visit was a longtime friend of Commander Massoud's, Bertrand Gallet, who sought to raise political awareness about the Afghan conflict.
تشریف آورید آقای ژنرال دوست ما و باقی اعضای هیئت افغانستان خیر مقدم خوش آمدید می‌گویم. مسئله دو پاکستان دنبال یک عمق اسلامی است در پالو یک عمق جغرافیایی.
I think that Pakistan, I'm convinced that Pakistan's goal is a lot more religious in nature than it is geographical. Osama bin Laden, who's much talked about in Afghanistan these days, was trained by the Americans back in the day. They can't deny it. It's in that context that he took control of all the big madrasas, Pakistan's Quranic schools. The resistance is so much bigger than that. It encompasses everyone who is Tajik, Pashtun, Hazara, and anyone else who understands the threat. They all oppose it. From this moment forward, all the ethnicities need to unite against this foreign invasion. We're living in the 21st century, and globalization is bringing us closer together. No one can continue to exist in isolation without any outside contact. It's a natural phenomenon. With a tolerant and moderate Islam, our people can live in peace both internally and within the international community.
I wore a pakol like a local. I speak the language, and since I didn't use French in front of them, they thought I was Afghan, which suited me just fine. I attended a number of those meetings. Massoud wasn't a fool. He was sharp. What he needed above all else was military support. If an intellectual or a politician rallied behind him for their own personal interest, so be it. What mattered was they showed up and brought back a vision that counteracted what many others in Paris were thinking.
But in the Western world, in the US and Europe alike, lobbyists for arms dealers were numerous and powerful, and Pakistan was a lucrative client. In their eyes, Massoud posed a problem.
Massoud was very good. He convinced them easily. We'll see where that leads in political terms, but I think we're slowly moving forward. A country like Afghanistan is so far removed from the current concerns of European parliamentary representatives. But this is how we'll get things to evolve, through trips like this one. They're tedious to put together, but they're productive.
Safe travels home.
My heart is here with you. So we'll be back. We'll be back to bring you to Paris and to Washington.
When Morillon returned to Strasbourg, he convinced Nicole Fontaine, the president of the European Parliament, to officially invite Massoud, which had never been done by anyone anywhere.
I think France's hands were tied by its relationship and economic connections with Pakistan, which were valuable back then. Of course, French intelligence services were in contact with Massoud, the same way they were in contact with the Taliban. They met with him regularly to ask questions about the situation, to understand how he saw things, and also to ask about Al-Qaeda. That was the major point of interest of the French intelligence services. Given that Massoud had a significant network of informants in the country, he might learn things about bin Laden or Al-Qaeda and share that information with the French. I shared military insights about the Somali Plain Front with French intelligence services with Massoud's permission. I was a messenger.
Eventually, reports transmitted by the Western secret services, including the CIA, gained traction. But America still insisted on sparing Pakistan. Washington decided instead to pressure the UN Security Council in New York City. The Council voted to impose sanctions on the Kabul regime.
Les talibans ne peuvent continuer à faire fi de la volonté de la communauté internationale en soutenant et abritant des terroristes en toute impunité.
The United States was in what I call a hyperpower phase. What I mean was that basically any other power, almost anywhere in the world, had to take U.S. policies into account. That didn't mean they needed to agree with those policies. In fact, the French government's position with regard to the U.S. at the time was to be a friend, an ally, but not necessarily aligned with them. That was unacceptable to the Americans. They thought, if you're an ally, you have to be aligned with them. Otherwise, you're useless.
The moment international sanctions were put into place, I knew the Taliban would become even more radicalized, and that the moderates who favored keeping communications channels with the Western world open would essentially no longer have it their way. As a result, it would be the radicals who would seize power. I tried to tell them that. I tried repeatedly.
The radicalization of the Taliban had brutal, inhumane consequences for women. Their rights regressed even further. And as those rights disappeared, any woman under suspicion could wind up imprisoned, beaten, or even stoned.
Thousands came to the stadium to see a woman die, a woman whose face we'll never see. We only know her as Sarmina. That's her in the middle between two female guards. The Taliban leader sentences her to death for adultery. Sarmina's 7 children watched her execution from the stands. Their uncle was the one who pulled the trigger.
Freedom for women? It's false to say that they had no freedom. They were not prisoners. Granted, they did not have Western freedoms, but they had Islamic, Quranic freedoms. And in our country, it's true that stoning as prescribed by Islam is allowed.
Women here are like ghosts, all shrouded in the same covering, the chadri. These clandestine images were filmed in secret. In Afghanistan, one can't even look at women from behind. And here, even their underwear is a man's business.
Women selling clothes? No way. Islam wouldn't allow it.
Because of this interpretation of the Quran, women's fashion in Afghanistan is entirely decided by men, from the cut of the pattern to the actual styles.
Before the Taliban arrived in Kabul, women played a major role in Afghan society. They held 80% of administrative positions and a third of medical jobs. Massoud encouraged equality and advocated women's return to public life.
Massoud était sur les fondamentaux, dans les fondamentaux de l'islam.
Massoud believed Islam's fundamental values that give women autonomy and the right to have an education. They fully belong in the organization of political life. And I think Massoud pushed for those ideas. Women's groups came to him asking him to sign a charter for women's rights, which he did. He was fully aligned with everything they brought up. He agreed with all of it, although he still added a line about how these clauses had to respect Afghan culture.
Another indication of the Taliban's radicalization was its intent to destroy all non-Islamic symbols. After forbidding children to play with kites, to listen to music, and to take photos of themselves, Taliban leaders now opposed looking at any work of art.
The Afghan government, with help from France and a protocol signed in 1921, had promoted national archaeology. By destroying those archaeological finds, the Taliban wanted to prove that Afghanistan had no other culture than that instilled by the Pakistani seminaries.
To access these beautiful rock carvings, one must take tunnels that lead to an opening above them, where one discovers beautiful frescoes that have already been mutilated and vandalized by art trafficking, organized by the country. This past Sunday, authorities in Kabul tried to reassure a Western diplomatic team who had come to investigate the destruction of artworks.
Just 2 hours after our last meeting, Mullah Omar announced the decision to systematically destroy all anti-Islamic works. Why? Of course, there were obvious ideological and religious reasons. To them, these statues represent idols and must be destroyed. But that's also a clear sign of radicalization. I contacted the Minister of Foreign Affairs and told him that if they did this, they needed to understand that those artworks would forever be destroyed. Stoning women was hard enough to swallow, but here you had something that had been around since the 5th century and which wasn't bothering anybody. I said, look, if you're really afraid that people will come and worship these statues, I'm sure I can find you a company somewhere that would be willing to manufacture and donate curtains. You can cover the statues and just open the curtains when people come to observe their splendor, as opposed to worshipping them. He said that was a great idea, and that he would relay it to Mullah Omar. He promised me that those Buddhas wouldn't be destroyed. He gave me his word.
The Taliban's relentless destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha statues in March 2001 was a huge shock. It revealed an extremely deep-seated way of thinking, which is why the world reacted the way it did. We were watching the resurgence of a way of thinking that most believed was a thing of the past. It was a doctrine that monuments and works of art from civilizations that are not our own carry ideological messages and pose religious dangers, and that they must be eradicated.
A proponent in favour of a moderate Islam, then French Minister Alain Madelin took a keen interest in Afghanistan very early on and visited the country on numerous occasions.
I went to Panjshir explicitly to meet Massoud and spend some time with him. He was a true force of nature, an extraordinary man. While I was there, Massoud gave me a clear message, warning of the dangers Afghanistan presented to the world. He warned that the Afghan people needed to be freed from this tyrannical regime. I told him that he needed to come to France.
The Ministry for Foreign Affairs was concerned for many reasons, but the main reason, according to one of the senior officials at the ministry, was weapons negotiations with Pakistan. We couldn't upset Pakistan.
The Ministry for Foreign Affairs didn't want him to come, which was strange, because in reality, and for many reasons, the French military had people on the ground there who knew the country. And they had a completely different opinion. They knew we needed to help Massoud, but their voices weren't taken seriously in military, diplomatic, and government circles.
I talked to people and offered them solutions. The Taliban were losing popular support, and there were Taliban commanders that we could have paid off.
In March, the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs invited a Taliban delegation. I offered to greet them because I was curious. I wanted to see what they were like, after having read so many horrible things about them. I remember they were completely closed off. They never looked me in the eye, even when we were 50 centimeters from one another. They didn't say a word. But it was done, and it probably had to be done, because we didn't know what was next.
This March 2001 meeting was highly secret. No cameras or media were present. Diplomacy required keeping all sides happy so as not to endanger the weapons deal with Pakistan. Invited by the European Parliament, Massoud made his first stop in Paris.
We had a good discussion with Mr. Vedrine, even though the meeting was extremely hurried. It began over breakfast, and the following discussion evolved into an extensive debate. The Europeans came to realize they were dealing with a real leader who was on the same level as they were. I had many other meetings with Mr. Vedrine afterwards, and every time he mentioned that first meeting with Commander Massoud. But before that meeting, it was obvious that they didn't trust us.
He was ecstatic about coming to Paris and very happy to be received by the minister. There's a certain prestige and status attached to that. Then he asked if the DGSE could help more by providing weapons.
He was trying to rally the international community to his side of the fight and prove that his fight was just and his enemy was a serious threat, not just to him, but to everyone. But nothing came of it except talk. He told me France didn't even give him a Kalashnikov cartridge. He raised his pinky and said it in Dari.
5 months before September the 11th, Massoud came to Europe to deliver a message.
پیام ما با آقای بوشی است که اگر در قسمت تأمین صلح در افغانستان توجه نشه و مردم افغانستان در راه رسیدن صلح کمک نکنه به یقین که مشکل نه تنها دامنگیر افغانستان بلکه دامنگیر امریکا و تعداد بیشتری از کشورها خواهد.
People met with Massoud and listened to him. He spoke in France, throughout Europe, and of course, some were adamant that he should receive aid. But what you need to understand is that there were just as many people, maybe more influential, who believed the opposite. They branded Massoud as a fundamentalist, just like all the others. someone who would never have a political future in Afghanistan and that it would be ridiculous to back him.
Massoud was officially greeted by European authorities, notably through his visit to the European Parliament in Strasbourg.
Welcome to the European Parliament. I'm so happy to have you here.
It seemed that his urgent message would finally be heard and taken seriously.
You all know that for a long time now, the European Parliament has been very concerned with what is happening in Afghanistan. The serious and repeated infringements of fundamental rights and human dignity, the appalling situation facing women, the famine that threatens the country, as well as refugees. I would venture to say that the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha statues was the straw that broke the camel's back, which confirmed beyond any doubt that the Taliban simply have no respect for anything. The invitation I extended is first and foremost the political acknowledgement of what Commander Massoud represents. But I must also tell you that the Pakistani ambassador wrote me a letter when his government learned that I had invited Massoud. That letter gives me the opportunity to give a strict warning to the Pakistani authorities. Their support of the Taliban constitutes a threat to the entire region. And in my response to this letter, I will formally ask Pakistan to cease supporting a regime which has ostracized itself from the world through its fanaticism and obscurantism.
گروهی که فعلا در افغانستان به نام طالبان قرار دارند یا دارای افکار و دارای نظریات به خصوص از اسلام هستند. گروه‌هایی که یارم همراهی میکنند مثل اسامه بن لادن، طالبای پاکستانی افکار مشابه به هم دارند. من میخوایم که از این طریق بگویم که تنها هدف از این گروه‌ها افغانستان نه، بلکه اهداف از او قدم اول افغانستان است، بعد خارج از افغانستان. و با کمال تأسف باید یادآوری کنم که در عقب همچو گروه‌ها با همچو افکار افراطی که دارند رژیم پاکستان و دستگاه استخباراتی آیسای پاکستان قرار دارد.
Alors la visite de Massoud en Europe a été une très bonne chose.
Massoud's visit to Europe was a very good thing, but it was also the worst possible thing he could have done for himself. I'm pretty convinced that's what gave the enemy the idea that Massoud had to be physically eliminated. That idea was hatched in the sick minds of Al-Qaeda leaders.
Je percevais la radicalisation forcenée.
I had noticed the fanatic radicalization of the Taliban, but I didn't really understand how much influence bin Laden had at the time.
Or, Ben Laden avait conclu un mariage d'un enfant du Mullah Omar avec...
Bin Laden had arranged the marriage of one of his sons to a daughter of Mullah Omar.
Et ça, c'était évidemment...
That meant their relationship became familial and dynastic, which posed a lot of problems. It was a gift to Mullah Omar in the sense that it gave him the last little piece of Afghanistan he was missing. Assassinating Massoud meant that he could launch a massive operation to conquer Panjshir and the entire northeast, ruling over the entire country. All of this without bin Laden sharing what he was planning in the US.
Al-Qaeda a considéré qu'une des failles.
Al-Qaeda thought that one of Massoud's weaknesses was his willingness to accept visits from journalists and politicians.
Les visites de journalistes ou d'hommes politiques.
They decided to use that as a way to get close to him. They would go in pretending to be journalists with a camera or batteries that were filled with explosives.
On September the 9th, 2001, two al-Qaeda suicide bombers met with Commander Massoud. The two terrorists pretended to be journalists working for Arab media outlets. Fahim Dashti, one of Massoud's loyal lieutenants, is one of the only two witnesses still alive today.
It's always hard for me to talk about what happened on September 9th, 2001. It always brings back terrible memories, the worst of my life. It was around 8 or 8:30 in the morning. When I came out of my room, I asked where those Arab journalists had gone. Someone told me they had already gone to the commander's headquarters to interview him. At the time, part of my work as a mujahid was to record videos. So I grabbed my camera and headed to the commander's headquarters. Before the interview started, the commander asked them to share what questions they were planning to ask. The Arab sitting next to the commander listed a dozen or so questions, mostly about Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Bin Laden, Pakistan, the war. It was always the same questions back then. When I sensed the interview was about to begin, I sat in a chair behind them and prepared my camera to film. I was suddenly blinded by a very strong yellow light. My eyes closed instinctively, and then I realized that I was burned and wounded. Since I'd been setting up my camera, the first thing I thought was that there may have been a short circuit and that it had exploded in my face. I managed to open my eyes, and I saw there was dust and smoke everywhere, and all the windows had been blown out. 2 people carried the commander from the room with his pako covering his face. He had injuries to his head and legs, but most seriously to his chest. When Commander Massoud was killed, for the first time in my life, I realized what a great responsibility that man had been carrying up until that time. Everything depended on him. Millions of us felt it, and we weren't strong enough to carry the weight of that responsibility. I once read a sentence in a book that said, "Woe betide a nation in need of heroes." And back when the commander was still alive, I thought that author was stupid. He didn't understand that it was great to have a hero. One should be so lucky. But when Massoud died, I finally understood what the author was trying to say. What he meant was that it's sad when people need a hero, because when that hero disappears, all is lost.
2 days after Massoud's assassination on Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001, at 8:45 a.m., an airliner crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Just 18 minutes later, a second plane hit the South Tower. Then a third crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a fourth in Pennsylvania. It was considered the worst terrorist attack in human history.
The two events are closely connected. Before the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda wanted to eradicate the leader of the resistance so there would be no more opposition to the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yes, Bin Laden certainly understood that Massoud was his enemy. Perhaps he thought that the U.S. would retaliate against Afghanistan after the attack on the Twin Towers. And if such a response occurred, he needed to ensure Massoud was gone because he represented the main opposition. The rest would work itself out, but the connection between the two events is absolutely obvious.
After September the 11th, the United States went after public enemy number one, Osama bin Laden, and took military action in Afghanistan. Helped by the Americans, the troops of the late Commander Massoud liberated Kabul in November 2001. The Taliban's departure was a relief to the local population. Massoud lives on in the memories of many for the people of Afghanistan.
My biggest regret is my own personal failure. I think that Massoud, he counted on me, at least a little bit. He counted on me to relay his message, but that didn't work. So it's a personal failure on my part. That said, the collective failure is even more consequential than my personal one.
Tout ça s'est passé comme une tragédie grecque.
It all happened like a Greek tragedy.
C'est un drame.
And the tragedy played out accordingly.
Des choses se sont mises en place et on a beau avoir.
Regardless of how much we tried, things always took a turn for the worse.
Toujours vers le pire.
Even still, to this day.
Encore aujourd'hui.